Okay, I think we're live. I want to apologize to everyone for taking a few extra minutes here. Our good friend Ethan Shawley from Self Host is going to join us as soon as I push that button. There we go. So now we should both be here on the live stream hanging out. And of course, our goal today is to talk about the 2024 Self-Host User Survey results from the survey that Ethan put out a few weeks ago, like he did last year as well. So Ethan, thank you so much for joining us today and giving me the opportunity to host what is effectively your event here. Mm-hmm. Oh, hold on. 1 second. Sorry, apparently we don't have audio. We don't have your audio somehow. Them. Um, that's so weird. Uh-oh. Hold on. I apologize. This is not at all what we want here. Oh, monitor. Hey, you. Will you give us another test there and see?
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Okay. For some reason, it was only in monitor, but not and monitor and output. Um, can somebody in the chat make sure that maybe his audio is working now? Much better. Okay. All right. I apologize, Ethan. Can you give me your your little intro there again?
Yeah, no, thanks for having me, David. More than happy to swap spots here. I know we chatted about the survey results last year on my podcast. Thought it'd be a cool opportunity to engage with you and your audience this year. I love the idea of the live stream. So I really appreciate the opportunity to chat with you on your channel. And for anyone who's following along, really appreciate the support and, look forward to chatting with everyone over the next hour or two.
Yeah, no, that sounds great. Again, apologies to everybody for how long it took us to get started, but we're using a weird platform I've never used before, and it will probably be the last time we do this. Volume is high though. Um, whose 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 audio is high? I can fix it if I know what's going on. Do, do, do. For Ethan. Okay. Ethan, I'm going to dial you back about 10%, and we're going to see what happens here. So, of course, the whole reason we're actually here is because Ethan is higher than yours. Okay, we'll adjust it as we go, as if it needs to still be adjusted here. Let's. Oh, there we go. That is what we're here for. Is the 2024 self-host user survey results. It looks like I just need to scroll down. I apologize. We're doing all of this on the fly. So it starts off saying thanks to all who participated to the 2024 survey. There were about 3,700 responses this year, which you said is like about double of what last year's was.
Yeah, I think we had about 1,900 last year. So super excited to have seen the responses to this year's survey. It was a little bit longer too. So cheers to everyone who completed it and stuck through the 30 or 40 questions that made up the survey.
Yeah, I after looking through this, some of the numbers surprised me, and I'm definitely excited to go through some of this. And it looks like you were able to collect a lot of great data. And of course, you've got all kinds of information about there, how everything was visualized and that sort of thing. So
Yeah.
let's get in. Oh, sorry. So go ahead.
No, yeah. I was. We were joking earlier when you and I had connected this week. I can't remember if it was on the stream or just while we were chatting offline. I feel like I'm a bit of a masochist for facilitating this survey every year. The first time I ran it last year, I was like, "Oh, this sounds like it'd be a great idea." It is a lot of data, and it has been a lot of work to compile.
Mm-hmm.
And I always want to drag my feet. So I'm glad we connected via live stream this year because it kind of lit a fire underneath me to get these results aggregated and out on time. So hopefully everyone appreciates it. It'll be nice to kind of have that behind me, and I can focus on more content and moving forward. But yeah, let's jump in.
Yeah, no, that sounds good. So the first segment here is about environment. And it looks like most people are doing for personal, which doesn't necessarily surprise me. Out of the 3,700, it looks like most most people are doing for personal reasons.
Yeah, and this is a bit of a weird question. I feel like, especially lead off, but it's really helpful for me because I think most of my content tends to be geared towards people who are self-hosting personally and for home labs.
Hmm.
But I know there are folks who self-host from an enterprise perspective, and it's always just really interesting to me to see how much of my audience lives in that world.
Sure.
And of course, my website, I use self-hosted analytics. I use web analytics. So I don't collect information about my users. And so this survey has just become a really good way for me to understand who's visiting my site and reading my content. And so
Sure.
even though this might seem like a weird question to lead off to, it's actually really helpful for me as a content creator.
No, I believe that. And I think it might even eventually, if it hasn't already, start helping you maybe add additional apps to your app directory or categorize them a bit differently depending on how people respond to surveys like this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the both sections, over 600 people are self-hosting for enterprise purposes, tells me I should probably be putting a little more emphasis into enterprise content.
Sure, and that's honestly one of the areas that I struggle with when I'm coming up with ideas for content. Because for a long time I took kind of a shotgun approach to just anything I ran across, I made content about. And now that I've started kind of dialing back to be a more home lab environment, people seem to enjoy that more. So I have to wonder how much of my audience is doing both personal and enterprise.
Right, right.
So no, that's an interesting number. I'm not honestly terribly surprised that most people are doing it for personal reasons, but the people who are doing it for enterprise are doing both as well.
Right, right. Yep. The next question, then, I should have probably put a disclaimer, approximately how many unique users are registered across your applications.
Hmm.
So I use a survey builder called Hayform. It's self-hosted. I self-host it myself on my server when I facilitated the survey. And it allows you to do kind of advanced logic and jumps from question to question. And so this question was actually only presented to people who selected either personal or both from the question above. I did not want to capture unique users for enterprises because I was nervous as to the scale of answers I would receive. I'm sure people do it for thousands and thousands of users at their place of work. So
Yeah.
this question was geared towards specifically home lab users. And I think the results of this were fairly similar to last year. A lot of people who are just doing it for themselves, they have their second user, I would assume probably a partner in some
Right.
capacity.
That's kind of what I was thinking as well on that.
Yeah, and then it peters out a little bit, but once you get to the 11 through 20 category, there aren't an insignificant amount of people who are sharing their personal services with 10 plus people, which is wild to me. I don't share with nearly that many.
I don't know if I know 10 plus people I would want to share my infrastructure with.
Yeah, that's fair.
All right. Well, I think the next one is one that interests me a lot, and that's why do you self-host?
Yeah, so again, I think most of these responses would have been around last year. But this is always interesting to me because uh, cost, I think cost is probably the most surprising when I look at that
Hmm.
because it's fairly low amongst it's beneath hobby, privacy, education, flexibility, which is surprising because I feel like such a large portion of the self-hosting community, at least that I see, are the outspoken people who are torrenting Linux ISOs
Hmm.
and such. And so I'm always under the assumption that it's such a huge factor, but it's really not, or at least not relative to some of the other factors. It still had over 2,000 responses, but hobby is the top one.
Hmm.
And to be frank, I'm not even sure what I mean by hobby when I added that. Like, I guess when I say hobby, it's just I enjoy doing this. I love sitting down on a Saturday morning, pulling up my stack, looking at updates, finding something new.
Sure.
So I guess that's probably where most people are coming from.
Well, but then very closely behind that is privacy, and I think that that's a big reason for a lot of people. I think a lot of people are doing things like even the FBI says we should be using ad blockers. Um, it's actually
Yeah.
there's another creator that I watch who has shown the page from the FBI's website or the CIA, one of the two, anyway, saying that you should absolutely be using ad blockers because there's so many malicious ads out there being pushed through different ad networks. Oh, I knew he was going to do that. Sorry, the kid came through, and my Akara picked up on him since I hadn't moved in a while, and he left. So give me just 1 second. Almost every live stream this happens. It's
Yeah, no
like,
worries.
and I was like, I'm going to go in and I'm going to turn off that. So I'm going to disable that
Yeah, and while
one.
you're doing that, David, I'll speak to someone in the chat's talking about privacy and talking about data not getting wiped when SaaS goes out of business. That's very true, and I think Google services are probably the biggest culprits for that. There's the infamous Google graveyard of services that
Killed
have
by
been
Google.
killed by. Yes, exactly. And that's absolutely a huge portion, I think, of why people are coming to things like self-hosting, and it's gaining popularity.
And I think one other thing, and I think it was actually Linus from Linus Tech Tips who mentioned something about this recently. That was, let's say you're using a hosted service somewhere else, and they get bought out. Well, there's nothing saying that your data is not going to get moved over to the new owners, whether you like it or not.
Right.
And they may want to take your data a completely different direction, again, whether you like it or not. And I think between privacy, ad blocking, that sort of thing, and not wanting my data sold to third parties are two of the biggest reasons that I've been doing this so intently for so long.
Absolutely.
Okay, so I'm being told that my volume is low compared to Ethan. Okay, so we're still fighting with that. Let's see. Okay, then I'm going to turn myself up a little bit. Okay, we're going to find a balance eventually. So, Sven, thank you for letting me know that. I appreciate it. Okay.
Someone says just start yelling. I love it.
So yeah, I turned up my microphone a little bit in software. That's funny. Okay, so I think, do we want to move on to hardware options then?
Yeah, let's do it. So the next question, select the hardware options used to deploy your software. So this was a question that allowed for multiple responses. And part of why I used Hayform this year was because it easily bakes another option that allows people to respond when I haven't included a response as a
Okay,
part of the multiple choice. And so I think Cloud VPS, I think that was the big one that I hadn't included, but people selecting other were allowed to enter their own option. And that was one
okay,
of the one of the issues with last year's survey. One of the pain points people communicated is once I aggregated the answers, if I didn't include something in my responses, I was left with just a bunch of other buckets of
sure,
responses that we didn't have any insight into. And so
okay,
this year that kind of allowed that. And so I think I initially missed Cloud VPS. Luckily, people were selecting other and adding it.
sure,
And in
sure.
hindsight, it's such a huge thing. I know people do it a lot. I still consider it self-hosting, even if people aren't hosting on premise. So I think this is similar. I was surprised last year, and I'm still surprised at how many people are using low powered devices. Although, to be fair, when I think of a low powered device, I think of something like a Raspberry Pi or
Sure.
something like that. But I think people are also grouping things like Intel NUCs in there, which are lower powered devices, and that would make a little more sense to me.
I agree with that. I've actually got several of them sitting over here. And I think in order to like really qualify that, you'd almost need to say, like 20 watts or less. Like there would almost have to be a power rating associated with each of those if you really wanted to dial in what each of those meant. And to go back and to kind of speak to the cloud VPS thing, I think what a lot of people are doing is using a cloud VPS as kind of a gateway to their home network, where they're only allowing the IP address from that VPS into. So they're kind of using it as a reverse proxy that way.
Right.
And that one comes up a lot in conversation when we do these live streams that we've been doing. That I've
Yeah,
recently started
makes
doing
sense.
again.
Another option that surprises me is desktop PC coming in third.
Yeah.
I'm always wondering, are the people just hosting things on their desktop PCs and then shutting them down and just using those services when they're booting it up, or are people just using desktop PC hardware and actually keeping it running 24/7?
Yeah, no, that's an interesting idea because I know there's like Docker on Windows. So is it just up and running while they're there? So really, that might be another distinction, kind of one of those if then this that, or if this then that. Sorry, I'm hearing an echo and it's throwing me off a little bit.
Oh, geez.
But if I turn down my monitor, I can't hear you. I'll get this sorted eventually. Oh, you know what? Can I do this? No. Oh, let's try it. Anyway, yeah, and like I actually did a video talking about using old like decommissioned workstations instead of a Raspberry Pi, because you can get in cheap on those, and while they're maybe not as efficient, they give you a lot more options.
Absolutely.
So,
Absolutely.
yeah. Well, cool. Let's see what our next section over here is. It looks like, do you deploy on a NAS?
Yep. So this is always just interesting to me. I expect the answers always to be geared towards yes, because a lot of people are there's a crossover between self-hosting and data hoarding and or media streaming, at which point people are collecting media and ripping Blu-rays and storing things. So it's just always interesting to see how many people have deployed something like a NAS somewhere within their home lab and are utilizing. But there are, what is this number? It's 1,300 that aren't deploying a NAS. So I don't know if they're using things or services that just don't require a lot of storage, maybe just like a password manager and running ad block on their network. I'd be interested in to hear more from those people.
Yeah, that would be a really good, a really interesting thing there. Let's see. Oh, so Allison asks, my question is about NAS is, would that include things like TrueNAS or Unraid? I would think so. Whether it's a purchased NAS or a built NAS, I would think that would qualify.
Yeah, and I should probably add a distinction next year, like who has a true NAS that is just network attached storage and who's also using their NAS as their primary server and running and deploying software and applications on it as well. It's a really good point.
Well, and actually, you kind of did, but it's a couple of questions from now, where you talked about the operating system that people are running.
Right.
But it might be kind of maybe a little bit of a like, is it a built NAS or a purchased NAS kind of situation? You might be able to break it down that way as kind of a sub question with this, just as an idea.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
So the next one is, do you self-host sensitive or important data, password managers, photos, etc.? I was surprised by the people that said no.
Yeah, so the question is, do you avoid self-hosting sensitive or important data?
I read it backwards. Okay, makes way more sense then.
Yeah, and I probably should color code yes and no and keep them the same on the charts regardless of which appears first, because it is deceptive. I realized that this morning as I was reviewing the results ahead of the live stream.
Sure.
But yeah, so most people aren't
they're not averse to
yeah, exactly. But there is a chunk, and I'm not surprised. And that was me for the first several years of my self-hosting journey. And I think it's a mixture of privacy. So being confident in your ability to deploy things and having access to them, but also having sound backup strategies.
Yeah.
So that if something happens to your infrastructure, that sensitive and important data is still around. And so I think the people who said yes here are the people who are probably paying for managed Bitwarden because they're more comfortable.
Sure.
With a hosted password manager that they know is secure because it's open source and audited, and they don't have to worry about it, which which is fine. I love Bitwarden and I support them and love, people who contribute to them. But
Sure.
I'm guessing it's those buckets of people.
That makes sense. And honestly, it was one of my biggest motivations to switch to like Proxmox was their backup solution and the way it just is so good. I did some bare metal stuff. I did some open media vault stuff for a while, and I didn't have a good backup strategy in place because I didn't really understand how to do that with them. I'm once I realized that Proxmox had such a slick backup solution in place, I went all in on that. It made so much more sense to go that route for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And in the chat here, Moist Hokie, which is a hilarious username, by the way, is talking about having self-hosted Bitwarden in the past. And absolutely right. It is easy to do. There's nothing difficult, especially with something like Vault Warden that makes it almost trivial to deploy. But again, the backups, the security, I think it's daunting to people when applications don't come with single sign-on if you're deploying something that usually manages your login. Not that Vault Board and other things aren't secure from a login or user authentication perspective.
Sure.
But absolutely. And something like Bitwarden, I think, is like $12 a year for the hosted version. So
that's not bad.
for some people, it's just a no-brainer. It would cost them more to keep their Vault Warden backed up for a year than it would to pay
Sure.
Bitwarden for the hosted version.
That makes total sense. All right. Well, I'm glad that I read that wrong initially, so that my perception of the answer was wrong. So
Yeah, that would be a very surprising question if it were the other way around.
yeah, yep. I was having some undiagnosed dyslexic moment, I think. So let's
no
actually
worries.
move on to what operating systems are installed on your servers.
Yeah, so I will say, as the person who prepares and aggregates the results of this survey, I hate this question, and it's because everyone always wants me to list actual flavors and distributions of Linux rather than just having Linux as an option. I try to list the options that I think are super specific and geared towards self-hosters and home labs, so
Sure.
like TrueNAS and Unraid and things like that. But things like Ubuntu and Debian and Arch and all those other things, there are too many to list. There were people who tried to sneak it in the other response, and I was like, no, I'm not doing that. I don't want a chart that has 30 different values and half of them only have 4 or 5 responses to them.
Sure.
So apologies in advance to anyone who finds that inconvenient, but it's there are almost just too many distributions out there. But
there's so many.
I don't think these responses are surprising. I think Proxmox is interesting as a second option, and I always add that because I'm interested in seeing how many people are deploying Proxmox. But it's like it is an operating system, but it's not, because everyone who's deploying Proxmox is also deploying something else on Proxmox.
I mean, like pedantically, it's a hypervisor, but it's still an operating system. Like it's
so maybe I should have a different question there that's just saying, do you use a hypervisor next year rather than lumping it in?
But then TrueNAS and Unraid allow you to run VMs and containers as well, I believe. So then you're just splitting hairs.
Absolutely. Yeah, and someone in the chat, or Moisogi, says same with ESXi, and that's absolutely the case. Either way, like, I feel like I still get a lot out of this question and the responses, so
Sure.
I'll probably keep asking it as is because I like seeing the distribution across things like this. Again, Raspberry Pi OS is fairly prevalent, but not as many responses as people who selected low power devices. So I don't know if I suppose that's confirmation that low power devices are more than Raspberry Pis. But I also remember in the other bucket there were some other Raspberry Pi operating systems that snuck in there. Some things like Diet Pi, I saw a few responses, and so that might also be contributing it. I'm a little surprised to see how low Unraid is, because I think it's such like a beginner gateway to self-hosting. I think a lot of people do that because the Docker community store and things like that make it so easy to spin things up, and of course the operating system manages your storage as well.
Sure. That's one that I've said a dozen times that I really need to get into, or at least look at. And I've had half a dozen people be like, hey, I've got an extra license if you want it. And well, and then I found out recently they're changing their licensing.
Hmm.
So I haven't taken the plunge yet, and I'm not sure if I will.
Yeah, I think a couple months ago they changed. I don't think you can buy lifetime licenses anymore. I think it's all
Annual.
annual, and if you don't, if you don't renew your license, you can still use Unraid. You just don't get the security updates and updates
Interesting.
that come along with it. I think is the model, which is understandable. They need something more sustainable than people who buy a license and then don't, use that for 20 years and just stick with that. A lot of
Okay.
good. I think based on I'm looking at some of the chat here talking about
Hmm.
hypervisors. I'm absolutely making a note about including a question on hypervisors next year rather than
Absolutely. I
lumping
think
that
that's
in
great.
with this. Oh, and Cyberpunk saying it looks like you can still buy a lifetime license for Unraid. It's just more expensive than it used to be.
Sure. Okay. Well, cool. I would honestly be curious about what the breakdown on Linux was, but I can't imagine the number of responses that would be in this list. So,
Yeah. I feel like the five distributions I can think of off the top of my head probably aren't even the five distributions most other people would think of. So it's just there are too
wow.
many. There's so many.
Let's see. For my now, see. Okay. Well, I tell you what. Yeah, let's take a look at backup strategies. And this is one that I still need to do better with.
Yeah. So this was a question. I actually tweaked the answers a little bit when I compiled the responses. In the actual survey, when I said offsite, I used like a friend or family's house
Hmm.
um, as one of the options, but there were other offsite locations people were talking about. Some people were using spaces at work
Oh,
for offsite backup, and that didn't quite fit in onsite or cloud. And so there are a couple more things lumped in with offsite. Um, but it looks like there aren't as many people deploying the 3-2-1 backup strategy
right.
as we like to preach. And there are about 250 or 225 people who are just completely winging it. And I think just crossing their fingers that nothing happens with their infrastructure with no backup strategy.
Yeah,
But there were a
that's
fair amount of people who were like, I don't have one, but I'm working on one. So I don't know if that was like
sure.
if they were actually were, or maybe they just felt a little guilted when they answered the question.
Yeah, or maybe it's just something simple like their self-hosting is a DNS manager, and it doesn't make sense. It might just be faster to redeploy it than try to restore a backup. It's the only thing I can think of other than people just raw dogging it.
Yeah, and it also might be people who have insanely large media libraries that just
Mm,
don't have the capability. Certainly not going to pay hundreds of dollars a month with cloud backups. Some
sure.
interesting comments here in the chat. So. Moist Hoagie is very obsessive about their backups.
Good.
All for that. 3, 2, 1. Does Buddy with a Garage data center count as offsite or cloud? I think I probably would have classified that as offsite, but I think it's tiptoeing the line there for sure.
Let's see. Yeah, that's that's an interest. Yeah, no, that is kind of an interesting question because not everybody has a friend with a data center in their garage, or even an internet connection that would support something like that.
Hmm. Yeah, maybe that person can introduce me to their friend with a data center in their garage. I'd love to get to know them a little more.
Right?
Someone in the comments also just chatted. Do you count RAID multi-disk redundancy as an on-site backup?
Ooh,
Uh, that I feel like that's the thing that has been hammered in my brain so much since I've started. RAID is not backup.
it's exactly what Allison
Um,
Fell said right there.
oh yeah, there it is. There it is in the chats. Every time someone asks about backups, it's always the first thing someone says, and it's true. It's
Rate is
redundancy, but it's
redundancy.
yes, absolutely.
All right. Yeah, no, I've definitely got to do something off-site. And I'm actually glad that our next question is which storage providers do you use for off-site? Oops.
Yeah, so this was an interesting question. Last year, I gave 5 or 6 options in the responses.
Hmm.
It was the big ones like Backblaze, Google Drive, OneDrive, Dropbox, and then my other option did not allow people to type in other things. And I remember my other bucket was so huge, and because of the survey software, we didn't have any insight, and we were trying to figure out what on earth are other people using that this other bucket is so big. So with Hayform, I didn't have that option, and other people were, when I didn't have someone in there, they were able to respond. And so looking at this, Hetzner, iCloud, BorgBase, I think those are some that I did not include, and they're popping up fairly high in the number of responses. So it's probably a combination of what we had missed last year in the survey and what we were trying to figure out when we reviewed the results.
Yeah, honestly, Hetzner surprises me. I guess I didn't realize they did storage. Like, I knew they did servers. I just didn't realize they did storage.
I agree. I had to Google it when I was compiling the answers. I was like, did people misread this question, or am I misunderstanding the answer? But absolutely, they do have data storage.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to compare Backblaze and Hetzner to see which one might make more sense for my offline or my offsite backups.
Mm-hmm. Hey, I'm a Backblaze guy. I love Backblaze,
Okay.
but there are enough responses at many of these that I think they're probably all worth checking out for someone who's only formulating their backup strategy now. So certainly don't let me discourage anyone from using something else.
Sure. No, that makes sense.
And see in the chat, someone's chatting about OneDrive. Mm-hmm. I assume most people are using things like Google Drive and OneDrive are using rclone to implement it. If you're not familiar with rclone, it's an easy way to connect to some of those cloud services.
Sure.
And I thought about maybe trying to spin that in this survey to see how people are doing that. But ultimately, I thought I was hitting the question limit, so I didn't include that.
Sure, that makes sense.
Oh, someone just mentioned rclone as well. Yep. There we go. Russell.
That. All right. Well, let's move on to our next section here, where we're going to talk a little bit about containers.
Yeah, everyone's favorite topic. This was this was one of the sections where I started with a yes or no question, and if anyone answered no, I just kicked them immediately to the next section.
Okay.
It was a nice thing about using a survey platform that had the advanced logic. So you'll see the total number of responses drop here because there were a small chunk of people that answered no, which is surprising, but maybe not. Maybe some of them are enterprise people who run things bare metal for better performance. I'm not sure what it is, but not surprised to see so many people deploy containers when they deploy their self-hosted software. And then even the next question, do you prefer container installations to bare metal? The people who say no are always just, it's wild to me. And I just assume maybe they're probably people with more experience and knowledge than I have, because it's a little terrifying to think of the number of containers I have spun up on my machines and thinking of trying to manage them and their dependencies on bare metal is a little daunting to me.
Yeah. Well, and I think, of course, that would even still be a container. I was thinking of like Proxmox helper scripts, but that's still containerization. So I'm just not going to say anything there.
Yep.
I agree with Allison. The containers rule for low power uses like Pi-hole, 100%.
Yeah, absolutely. And to be transparent, I don't work professionally. I'm not in a technical field, so I don't know how enterprises manage things. So I don't know. Are containers used heavily in enterprise environments, or do people tend to gravitate towards bare metal installations? I think I've read enough about databases that I think people or enterprises generally shy away from containerizing databases. I just don't know about other things.
Yeah, I'm not sure. But I mean, even if you wanted to, like, even setting up a VPS on bare metal is technically a container.
Fair.
Right? So
yep.
I guess it depends on what the end goal is for each individual project.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's just a lot more nuance than I realized.
Sure. All right. Well, let's talk a little bit about orchestration then. Let's
yep.
do this.
So this popped up last year too. This question. I'm not incredibly surprised to see the responses to this. I don't deploy anything myself. Especially I think for people who are doing this as a hobby or people who might work in a technical field, and the complexity of something like that might just be too much for them when they come home and want to manage things in their home lab. I think that's a common sentiment I hear across the community.
Yeah, I actually, for a while, thought about learning something like Kubernetes and then realized it didn't, I would have to force myself to use an orchestration software like that when I could just containerize things and simplify my life a little bit.
Hmm. Yeah, and Cyberpunk in the chat is talking about using Ansible for orchestration.
Mm-hmm.
That's a great use case, or that's a great point for people who want the benefits of it, but maybe not the complexity given what Ansible can do
Yeah.
within the infrastructure.
Yep. I actually got into Ansible a little bit recently just to help me manage updates on my VMs and my LXCs and that sort of thing. But I've got to switch some scheduling on it to make it a bit more practical for things going on around the house.
Yeah. Yeah. I see Moise Hoagie's talking about Kubernetes in a professional environment makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Feels like overkill at home. Jumping back to the question, why do you self-host? Education was actually one of the responses and gets a fair amount.
Mm-hmm.
I actually, when Kubernetes comes up, I see a lot of people talk about it within the context of they're trying to learn it for their professional lives. So they
Sure.
want to be able to deploy it, or they're just trying to boost their resume for, if they're a college student who wants to apply for jobs in a couple of years. So I wonder what bucket of these yes responses are people who fit into that.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea there too. Huh. Let's see. Russell says that he uses Ansible Semaphore to be exact. That's actually what I use is Semaphore in a container. So
Love it.
yeah, no, that's again, I just use it a little bit and it does everything I need it to do for the way I've got it configured right now. So big fan.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see what we have next. The orchestration. What platforms do you use for deployment? Docker, LXC, Podman, or other?
Yeah, I'm interested in hearing from people. Feel free to add it to the chat. I saw someone ask this in a survey several years ago, and I was like, oh, that's interesting. But I don't know that I find it incredibly helpful to have anymore. It's interesting to see how many people are using something other than Docker. And I know LXCs are big, especially if you're a Proxmox user.
Mm-hmm.
But I've contemplated maybe dropping this question in the future. I don't think the responses here are incredibly surprising or insightful.
Sure.
But I'm open to that not being the case.
Sure. Well, and I'm in a weird boat where I deploy LXC containers with like a Bear Debian 12 and then put Docker on that. So I really, really like to overcomplicate things.
Yeah, no kidding. That gives me a headache almost just trying to think about that.
I've actually got a bash script that I can do like a curl and then deploy it, and it installs everything, all the dependencies and everything for me. So it simplifies things a little bit.
Oh, okay.
But still, I know I'm convoluting things for the sake of convoluting things.
Yep. No, that's fair.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, jumping to the next
Yeah.
question. Do you deploy management software to administer your containers? So there are a lot of people out there using things like Portainer. Yacht, actually, I don't know what happened to Yacht. I feel like I haven't seen Yacht pop up in a while. I know it's really promising. It might still be in beta.
So my understanding with Yacht is it was initially it was just like one dude who built it. And then kind of got sidetracked with life and things came up and he kind of had to backburner it for a while. And I think that's kind of the similar thing that happened with the Dockage or DocJ or whatever it's called. It was just like one dude's like, I've got this idea. And it's a very good idea, but if you're just one person trying to build a project like this, it gets complicated when you've got to run your life and continue to maintain a project.
Yeah, absolutely. And I almost think, I wonder how many of the yes responses in here are also considering Unraid. I would almost consider Unraid something like this because it is a management interface for containers. Even though you get a lot of the similar options when you're deploying them, you get kind of the consolidated start, restart, logs, all that functionality from there as well. And I
Hmm.
also see people in the chat talking about things like Casa OS
Hmm.
and some of these other things that seem to have popped up in the last year or two,
Hmm.
seem to be getting bigger and bigger, which I love. They remind me a lot of Unraid as far as just being very welcoming
Yeah,
to people who are new to self-hosting, streamlining things, kind of letting them easily deploy applications, coming with a proxy and maybe some sort of single sign-on platform.
100%. It was actually I did a couple of different series on Casa OS, and it's a very intuitive, welcoming interface. Just the general aesthetic. When I first saw it, I was like, "Is Mac self-hosting now?" Like, just it was very slick. It was very inviting. And it's a great platform if you want to host something and not have to get into the weeds about, how do I set up these different things. You just click the app you want and install it. And I
Hmm.
really love how simple they've made that. Very similar to like Unraid and that sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I have a love-hate relationship with them myself. I have Portainer installed on my servers just
Hmm.
as a way to get to things easily if I need them. But I feel like once you start to get into the more complex things with deploying containers,
Hmm.
the interfaces become frustrating at times, especially when you're trying to troubleshoot. But I will never knock them because I think they are such a great gateway for people who are new to
Yeah.
self-hosting and things like that. So
Yep.
not dissing on anyone who is using them. Again, I have
No.
Portainer deployed in my home lab. So they're
Sure.
great.
In fact, if it hadn't been for Open Media Vault, I wouldn't be doing this because Open Media Vault gave me the baseline to start learning on. And
Hmm.
it's like, well, here's how to create users, and here's how to create shares, and here's how to do all of these different things. And initially, they had like plugins for things. Well, initially like Plex and that sort of thing, but they removed it, and then they added they had plugins for like Portainer, and they had plugins for Yacht, and being able to kind of use that as my launching pad basically gave me a chance to experience it, like kind of like we talked about, like figure out how to fix a gap in my needs and then kind of go from there. And Open Media Vault was a great way for me to do that. And now there's COS OS and that sort of thing. I think it's great.
Absolutely. Looks like Moist Hoagie is saying they still use Portainer, and you can blame DB Tech for that. I'm sure there's a good backstory there.
I pushed Portainer a lot very early on, because it's what I was comfortable with. I wasn't interested necessarily in getting into a command line and that sort of thing. I was still trying to learn how to self-host. And because I was actually pushing it so much, in fact, people here may not know this, Portainer reached out to me.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they a great team of people. And I actually did some contract work for them for a while. Like they paid me to work for them for a while.
Wow.
But my mental health wasn't good, and they gave me too much freedom, and I didn't trust myself.
Hmm.
So I was like, "Look, I appreciate this. I just can't do it, but thank you." And we left on good terms, and obviously in my videos, I still show it. I still show how to use it, that sort of thing. So big fan.
Hmm. No, that's great.
Yeah.
So jumping on to the next one, how do you manage container updates? This is
Yeah.
always an interesting question. Do you do it manually? Do you let it happen automatically, or do you do both? Really appreciate the answers. A lot of people who are doing it manually, probably as it should be.
Mm-hmm.
I fall into the both category though.
Same.
There, when you can pin images, containers to major versions, and you don't have to worry about compatibility when there
Right.
are updates, that's when I automate things.
Mm-hmm.
So, like databases, if I can pin like Postgres 15 or something and know that it's not going to upgrade to 16 unless I explicitly state that, I'm fine with those updating as they come along.
Which I think
Um,
brings up an interesting thing that has been brought up to me in the past. Oftentimes, using a version is safer than using latest as the tag for your containers. And specifically for the reason that you're talking about there, updating from version 15 to 16 is often catastrophic.
Absolutely. I'm always it's only a practice I've picked up in the last year or two, admittedly, but I'm always so excited when I deploy a new container. I'm like, oh wow,
Mhm.
they actually will let me pin major versions. A lot of software doesn't do that,
Mhm.
unfortunately, and that's fine. You know, it is to their own. I'm not complaining about free and open source software, but I get giddy when I can do that and don't have to
Sure.
worry about the complexity of that.
Yeah, looks like Collins here does the exact same thing with pinning major versions for databases specifically.
Yep,
So
yep, they're a great
that's
example for that.
100%. Well, all right then. Let's take a look at networking.
Yeah, so first question on the list, if self-hosting for personal use, do deploy a firewall aside from the router provided by your ISP. So I'm thinking things like OpenSense and PFSense. I deploy OpenSense myself.
Mhm.
And it's very close to an even split here.
Yeah,
And I
it
don't think that's
is.
particularly surprising because firewalls are they're tricky. I remember when I first deployed OpenSense, when I moved into my house when we bought it a few years ago. I think my internet was down like every other hour for the first 3 days as I was trying to figure out how to use it and configure it.
Hmm.
And it's like there are a lot of when I'm spinning up something like Vault Warden or Plex or something, if it goes down, there's not a lot at risk. If my firewall goes down, then there's a ton at risk, and
Yep.
I think that leads a lot of people to not being interested, especially people who are managing them at work and don't want to do it at home.
Absolutely. And like you said, they because of their complexity, they're often very intimidating to get started with. You don't know where to start. You don't know how to set up routes, and a lot of other words I don't understand because I don't do it.
Yeah,
Um, I've got the drop into my house, and I've got an enterprise or small business network solution in place that's got or intrusion detection and prevention, and that's me.
yeah, and there's I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think I picked up OpenSense because I like the idea of okay, it's my firewall. It's one stop shop for a lot of things that I don't want to rely on another machine that could go down at any time.
Hmm.
So I have like a dedicated machine for OpenSense. That's where I run WireGuard. So when I'm trying to VPN from outside of my network, it doesn't matter what is happening with my other machines as long as my firewall up. That's good. It's
Hmm.
also where my ad block is. I have 5 VLANs and it's probably overkill. I did that for privacy reasons. Like I have one for my cameras, one for
Hmm.
my smart home devices, and it's probably just more paranoia. I think it's very unnecessary at the end of the day, probably, but it's fun to do, and I'm learning a lot.
I think it's important to definitely separate some of the smart devices that we've brought into our house, because it's so easy for companies to add additional software to those after the fact to do network sniffing and things like that. And again, paranoia, 100%.
Hmm. Yeah,
But
absolutely.
but why not be safe?
Right, right. And see some people in the chat talking about firewalls not being an issue, but email maybe staying away from. We'll get to that in a few questions because I think very many people feel similarly to that.
Yeah, I actually made an entire video dedicated to why I'll never host my own email. And people responded to that saying, I've been hosting my own email for like 15 years and it's never been an issue. Cool.
Yeah.
I don't want to take on that headache. I've worked in kind of the enterprise area before where somebody got on our network and destroyed our IP's reputation. And going and trying to get that back was just a nightmare.
Hmm.
And if
Yeah.
you're especially if you're on a public like on just a regular ISP, you don't know who had that IP address before you.
Hmm. Yeah, it feels like it's always some random guy on Reddit who's like, I've been doing this for 40 years. I've never had an issue. It's
Hmm.
like, well, that sample size is a little small, and I have no idea if I can verify what you're saying is accurate.
Right.
Um, But before we move off this question, a couple
Mhm.
interesting points in the comments. Absolutely true. So James Collins says a lot of what we do in the self-host home lab space is more or less unnecessary. We do it because we want to and because we can. I think that's true. I
100%. Yeah.
probably misspoke when I said something to the counter just a bit ago. And then some people making comments about it's not paranoia because we know companies are engaging in snooping and sniffing traffic,
Mm-hmm.
even if not necessarily for awful purposes, just for advertising. Not that that's not awful, but I think there are worse things you can do with people's data.
Right.
That's justification enough, I think, for people to engage in stuff like this.
Well, and I think even what Allison said, saying if you've got a camera, that's a huge vulnerability. There have been so many horror stories of like baby cams getting hacked and awful things being said to small children in the middle of the night.
Oh, that's terrifying.
Yeah, so I think like Allison said there, separating your cameras out, like all my smart light bulbs, they run on a separate network, or they should. I'm not sure if all of them do. I think some of them do. I really need to go back and reconfigure some things, but yeah, no, I think it's super important to have some different networks set up for different things.
And actually, James Collins, I remember that popping up in the with Wise some
Mm-hmm.
time ago, where you were getting access to other people's
Mm-hmm.
camera feeds because of the nature of how Wise streaming works, where it's going out and then coming back in order to get your own feed.
Yep.
Next question: how do you access your self-hosted software remotely?
Mm-hmm.
I know we had a similar question last year. I don't think super surprising results or responses, although I will say there's a surprising amount of people who forward ports. And I don't know, maybe I should have asked for elaboration from people who do that.
Mm-hmm.
If you're running a single application that is developed by some guy in his free time and doesn't have strong authentication, I'm not sure that's something you should be forwarding ports for. But I think there are also things you probably are fine forwarding ports. Like I know Plex has their port that people generally consider safe to forward. So I don't know. I wonder who those people are, what they're forwarding.
I think for a lot of that, it also boils down to game servers. Because I've run into situations where I've hosted a couple of different game servers, and the apps or the games when you're trying to connect won't accept a fully qualified domain name. So it relies on an IP address and a port, and I think that's possibly what some people are doing here is hosting game servers for their friends to jump in on.
Yeah, that makes sense. And correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm not a networking expert or guru. Don't some game servers and I guess even applications rely on network protocols that can't necessarily be proxied by a lot of the proxy software we'll see in the next question?
I don't have an answer for that. I'm genuinely not sure because I'm in the same boat. I see people who can do like network hex values in their head. I'm not that guy. I'm just not.
Yeah, me neither.
I have lots of respect for those people, but I'm just not that guy. So networking is not my strongest suit.
Yeah, same. Maybe next year we'll have to invite someone who's a little more of a network expert than
That would
we
be
are.
amazing.
The next question I think is really interesting and interesting. It appeared last year, but I don't think I broke out Nginx last year, and so it was really interesting to see that not only top the chart again, but also to see the split of how it topped the chart. Because here alone, I have 3 different implementations of Nginx. We have Nginx Proxy Manager, which I know is super popular because it's such an easy way to deploy Nginx for people who love managing things with an interface. We have the second one, just Nginx. I'm assuming that's just plain old Nginx, like just bare Nginx, where people build everything from scratch themselves. And then down towards the bottom, Swag, which is the Linux servers team's implementation of Nginx, which comes with a couple other things baked in. I think fail to ban and at least something else, and automates the search for you. So clearly, Nginx is the most popular of the web servers here.
100% I agree with that. Yeah. I for for all of the elitism that I see on Reddit and people saying if you use Cloudflare tunnels, you're not a true self-hoster. I'm actually really glad to see Cloudflare tunnels that high.
Yeah, a lot of people diss on Cloudflare a lot, but again, I think they give a lot of people a peace of mind that they might not otherwise have without something like it. And I know there are a lot of privacy implications to Cloudflare. but there are also a lot of benefits to using. As a matter of fact, I use Caddy for my personal infrastructure, but for my website self-host, I rely on Cloudflare tunnels just
Sure.
because of the amount of traffic I have coming into my website versus my personal services. So
Sure. Well,
I'm there
and
with you.
I mean, they technically can man in the middle of your stuff, but we're kind of the guinea pigs so that they can monitor traffic to look for anomalies for their enterprise customers.
Hmm.
So they don't care about our traffic. Like I've talked to people at Cloudflare and they don't care about our traffic. They're looking for anomalies that they can use to train their systems to block stuff for their enterprise paying customers.
Yep. Yeah, it makes sense. It's just a hard thing to prove to the
Right.
skeptics out there.
Yeah.
And I guess the ability is there, it's just that they
Hmm.
don't necessarily act on it.
Right. Yep. Yep.
I see James Collins asking about Nginx Proxy Manager.
Hmm.
I feel like recently I actually saw an update come through that, and I was surprised because I don't see many come through. I think there's also a fork of Nginx Proxy Manager out there right now, and it popped up in some of the responses. I did not separate it because I didn't know if everyone was specifically referencing that. I kind of combined it all together.
Hmm.
I can't remember what it is. If it's like a Nginx Proxy Manager NG or NGX, kind of like the
Oh.
paperless
Hmm.
fork and some of the other things that have popped up. So that might be worth checking out if you're looking for Nginx, but maybe not happy with the pace of development for the original Nginx Proxy Manager.
Yeah. I actually, as much as I used to promote and talk about Portainer, I used to do the same thing about Nginx Proxy Manager. And then something broke severely that really made using it difficult for a long time.
Hmm.
And ultimately, that's what ended up pushing me more towards Cloudflare tunnels initially. It just like there were certain steps you were supposed to take with it that didn't work anymore with Nginx Proxy Manager, and then I just haven't really looked at it since then.
Yeah. I used Nginx Proxy Manager early on as well, but
Hmm.
I'm an Authelia user, and at least when I used it, I remember it was such a pain to get the configs in there to be able to proxy something through Authelia. It was
Dude.
like I remember it was just lines and lines of text where you had to tweak like 3 lines with the appropriate, I don't know,
Hmm.
IP addresses or ports or whatever, and then chuck it in the config, and it was just a headache. So,
It's
um,
funny.
yeah.
This last Thursday, I did kind of an interview with the folks at 45 Drives, and they asked me about one of the hardest videos I ever made, and it was Ithelia with Nginx Proxy Manager. It
Absolutely.
took me like a week of troubleshooting along the way and shooting everything to get it into a cohesive format that people still use. Like I'm just blown
Hmm.
away when I get comments like, "Hey, this still works all these years later." But is Athelia is a great idea, but integrating it with Nginx Proxy Manager was a nightmare.
Hmm. Absolutely. I use Caddy now. I see someone's asking about Authelia with Caddy,
Hmm.
and not Nginx Proxy Manager. Authelia is a breeze with Caddy. I don't have to think about it.
Wow.
It's like they have snippets, so I have I think 4 lines to bring Authelia into my Caddy file, and then it's 1 line to add it to a subdomain or a path. So
Wow.
it's like brainless to incorporate it with Caddy. Maybe it's changed for Nginx Proxy Manager. I'm not sure.
Sure.
But
Interesting.
traffic's towards the top of this question of responses.
Hmm.
I've never tried traffic myself. I know it's popular, it's recommended. I'm a caddy guy now because of
Yeah.
its simplicity. I'm not sure what it would take to get me to move away.
The so I've so I was actually a traffic ambassador for a while. I made some content about it,
Hmm.
and it's really neat in what it can do. But again, it's a lot of setup. Going through, like, in order to get your containers, at least when I used it, in order to get your containers to connect to it, you had to go back into like the Docker Compose or the stack or the whatever and add traffic specific labels to each of your containers to get traffic and your container to talk to each other and agree that they should be working together.
Hmm.
And it was just so tedious. So that's
Yeah.
also getting traffic to work with a container on a different piece of hardware or whatever was a nightmare. I was told it could be done, but with like Nginx Proxy Manager, you just say, "Hey, point to this IP address on this port," and you're good. Traffic
That makes sense.
was not was not
Huh.
that at all.
That's crazy to me. I have to believe so many people are doing that, that there's not a more elegant solution within traffic.
And look, there may be at this point. This has been like 3 years ago.
Okay. All right.
So it may have evolved since then, but all of the labels that were necessary to get a container to work with traffic were just mind-numbing to me.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that makes sense. Next question here, and I'll just keep moving along because I feel like we're going to spend a lot of time when we get to the software
Yeah.
question. A lot of good questions there. Do you utilize a custom domain for your self-hosted applications? A lot of people said yes. That's not a surprise.
No.
A lot of people don't want to remember IP addresses and ports to get around
No.
their services. There were a chunk of people that said no, and that's fine. I'm not sure if those are like maybe people who are using something like DuckDNS or maybe internally and not categorizing themselves.
Right.
But the next question then is interesting. And this is another one that's similar to one of the questions above, where last year I added a bunch of popular ones that I was aware of, but didn't allow people to elaborate. And there were a bunch of other that weren't necessarily sure what they were. This year I was able to capture a lot of that.
Okay.
Cloudflare has popped up again as a large one.
Yeah.
And I'm still not sure if people are just confusing the fact that they use Cloudflare for just DNS routing.
I think you can buy domains from Cloudflare now.
Right. And so I tried
Oh.
to specify in the question, like, hey, if you choose Cloudflare, choose it because you're purchasing a domain from them, not just because they're managing your DNS for your domain.
Right.
But it still popped up. So I guess more people are just using Cloudflare to buy their domains directly than I would guess.
Yeah. Namecheap doesn't surprise me. I've promoted Pork Bun a lot over the last few years, and that's not to say that I'm the reason for this number, but they're a great company to work with.
Yeah, Pork Bun's great. That's who I use, and I actually think they use Cloudflare. They have something Cloudflare on the back end. So they're hand in hand, I think, with Cloudflare in some capacity.
Yeah. Let's see.
Then we have DuckDNS making an appearance here. I thought Google Domains was going away, maybe in the Google graveyard. So I was surprised to see so many responses. Maybe there's a grace period yet for that.
Maybe that's what it is, because they got moved over to like Squarespace or something.
Yeah. And I see James Collins in the chat talking about moving domains to Cloudflare because of Google Domains going away. And maybe that makes sense. Maybe people who are at Google Domains are using Cloudflare to manage DNS. So with that going away, it just was natural to transfer those domains to Cloudflare right away.
Sure. Well, that makes sense. All right. There was a little bit of some subtext down here.
Yeah. So this is one of those things, like the other bucket is so large. I didn't want to just say, hey, there were a bunch there, there were others, because I didn't want someone to say, was there another one that was large that wasn't included? There are 253 domain providers submitted as responses to this question, which blows my mind. I probably couldn't name 15 off the top of my head when I'm not reviewing these results. So anything with fewer than 25 responses was categorized as other, which included 237 providers across the 650 responses that are in that other bucket. So people are using a lot of different things. There are a lot of country-specific domain providers or registrars that pop up, where it was just like probably two or three people who selected them. And also people misspelled them a lot because of the free text field. So this was one of the more difficult questions to aggregate.
I believe that. I do. All right. Well, let's move into software. Let's talk about email servers.
Yeah, and so I feel like we just talked about this question. The number is surprising only in the sense that 600 people seems like a lot of people to be self-hosting an email server. Those are the people who I think just pop into discussions and say, oh yeah, it's a breeze, don't worry about it.
Right.
I have no issues with it. And then the next question, just ask a little bit about, okay, what components are you self-hosting? Because I know there are people who will self-host just the client, which I think is really easy. If you have something like Roundcube, it's a really popular webmail client.
Right.
Because they come with plugins that lets you unify inboxes across services. So even if you're not self-hosting the sending and receiving, you still have everything in one place because you're self-hosting.
Sure.
And so the split sending was at the top of the next question, was the most popular. Receiving, I think I would have guessed that they would have been swapped, that receiving was more popular because it's probably a little easier. Although I don't know, maybe it's harder to filter the spam out than it is to go through the hoops to make sure your sent emails are being sent properly. I'm
Sure,
not
that
sure.
makes sense. Okay.
But interesting question. Maybe one day we'll try to self-host email.
All right. Well, this one is talking about media streaming.
Yeah, so last year I think I geared it towards like movies and shows and video streaming, but I tried to keep it open because there are a lot of other popular streaming platforms out there that people are streaming more media than just those things. Audio is a big one.
Mm-hmm.
I think Jellyfin took more of a lead this year than they did last year versus Plex,
Mm-hmm.
which is surprising because I don't think there are more Jellyfin users out there in the world than there are Plex users. I'm not sure if it's just the communities I tend to frequent are
Could
more
be.
likely to use open source software like Jellyfin versus something like Plex. I have no idea.
I think there's also I don't want to say elitism necessarily in this case, but I think people are definitely leaning towards the open source media players lately, based on what I've seen, like on Reddit and places like that. And I think part of it has to do with like we talked about earlier, like the ability for a company to like interject a script to maybe call home and be like, hey, they're watching this for marketing purposes, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas with Jellyfin, it's all local, it's all self-hosted, that's probably the mindset that people are going with regards to self-hosting Jellyfin over Plex.
Yeah, probably. And I think Plex is easier for newcomers, and I think media streaming is often what initially brings people to
Mm-hmm.
self-hosting. Just the complexity of external access for Jellyfin. Not that when you're comfortable with things, it is super complex, but it's more complex when you're new to things than Plex
Sure.
is because you don't need your own custom domain or anything like that to let
Right.
other people outside your network use it.
And then Allison actually brings up an interesting point about Jellyfin not needing like a pro account or a paid account for GPU transcoding. And I think that may be another big part is people are again trying to cut the cord and they don't want to pay for something they've already got all the hardware to do.
Hmm. But then you have Jellyfin's free,
Mm-hmm.
but their client support isn't nearly what Plex is, and is that
Yep.
because Plex is paying developers for a robust
Mm-hmm.
variety of clients across TVs and mobile devices. I'm not trying to stick up for one versus the other, but there
Sure.
are great points on both sides.
Absolutely.
And there's some other, by the way, there are other really great platforms in this question. I don't want to stick to I wouldn't want to ignore the fact that there are platforms like Audio Bookshelf for
Mm-hmm.
ebook for audiobooks and podcasts. I know they support.
Right.
Navidrome is a great subsonic compatible music server.
Sure.
Subsonic there, Peer2 lightweight music server is also another great music streaming server, a little less known, but it's
Mm-hmm.
just as capable, I think, as some of the other ones.
Nice.
So people should definitely check out some of these other options that are listed here.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, we have here platforms for remote file storage or syncing.
Yeah, so we're in the part of the survey. I expanded a little bit. I didn't have some of these questions last year, but
Mm-hmm.
pick some of the more popular categories of self-hosted applications just to get some idea as to what people are using. And so this is a big one. I'm not really surprised Nextcloud is at the top.
Right.
I see a lot of people use Nextcloud. A lot of people also complain about Nextcloud and how bulky it can be
Mm-hmm.
and resource intensive and slow it can be at times. But there's no doubt it's useful and has its cases.
Yeah.
And that's why people are using it.
I'm actually in that later camp, or that latter camp rather, about complaining about Nextcloud, for all of the reasons you mentioned. But again, like you said, it's got a huge community of people that use it because it works for them. I actually used SyncThing for a while to back up my phone to Open Media Vault, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But now I just use the Synology software on my phone to back it up, that sort of thing. And it looks like that's actually mentioned on here as well. So, yeah.
Yeah, and that was second. File browser is another good one. That's
Mm-hmm.
just a web app for accessing files from a browser.
Yeah.
It's not, and so that's why I noted access in the question there because it's not storing or syncing anything. It's just allowing you to easily get to your files from a web browser.
Sure.
But a lot of great ones listed here. I
Mm-hmm.
use SFTP Go. I find that helpful
Okay.
for accessing things on the run or from different machines at times. It has great use cases.
Okay. I'll have to check that out.
The next question is a doozy. It's probably, I think, the most saturated category of self-hosted applications that I come across, and it's
Mm-hmm.
documentation, note taking. And I think I talked about this a couple days with you.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I'm not sure I know where to draw the line between note taking and wiki and documentation.
Right.
Like I just kind of lump them all together at this point
Sure.
because I think people are probably interchanging them and intermingling them for different purposes.
Mm-hmm.
But this is really interesting. Obsidian's at the top. I specifically said in the question Obsidian with the self-hosted sync server. So Obsidian isn't necessarily self-hosted.
Mm.
By default, I think it uses their backend for storage, but you can self-host a sync server. I don't think it's official. I think someone developed it that can sync your notes. So I'm assuming most people who chose that are doing something like that, or maybe just keeping things local
Mm-hmm.
and then syncing with something like SyncThing back and forth. And you have some other ones popping up. So Bookstack,
Mm-hmm.
really great platform. I'm not surprised I don't think I've ever seen someone speak poorly about Bookstack. It is such a
No.
fantastic application.
Mm-hmm.
There's Nextcloud popping up, the Swiss Army knife of self-hosted tools. David? Wait, are you using anything for documentation? Are you using Next, or what are you using?
So I've got a couple of different ones that I'm using. Actually, the site that I was using for a while is kind of my wiki. It's like my supplemental for my videos where I was posting like Docker Compose and things like that for the videos was in Bookstack. And it's actually still up and running. I've got a Memos instance up. I've got a HedgeDoc instance up. And it really depends on the day which one I use.
That gives me a headache thinking about again.
Yeah. No, I often forget which application I use to take notes on that particular subject.
Oh gosh.
So it's definitely, I'm a very scatterbrained person by nature. And some of the things I do in my own home lab demonstrate that very, very well.
Yeah, some interesting conversation in the chat right now. So Russell loves Obsidian. Again, I don't think there's a self-hosted app like Obsidian, at least not yet. It has so many capabilities and so much functionality. I think it's hard to replicate. Russell is using a plugin to sync from his local T. James is talking about DocMost. I actually just streamed last night chatting about DocMost. I think it's a relatively newer software that's been received really well. So I am similar. It is already fairly high on the list given how young it is. So I can only imagine where it's going to be next year. I agree with that sentiment wholeheartedly.
Yeah.
And I see Jeremy Lakes talking about NotesNook. I think just a couple months ago, they launched their own self-hosted sync server. It might still be in beta, but this is another really aesthetically pleasing note-taking application that it has generally been hosted, but now they're allowing people to sync their own backend. So that's starting to fall into the self-hosted bucket here.
Let's see. Yeah. Moist Hoagie, different note-taking app for each day of the week, basically. Yeah. That sums me up pretty well. Oh, all right. Let's see.
It's chaotic.
Very, very.
So the next couple questions are about smart home, and I don't know that I will include them in next year's survey. I tried to expand on some of the smart home content because last year Home Assistant was actually the most popular. In the question we'll talk about below, what's your favorite self-hosted application? I think Home Assistant was number one. So I'm like, I feel like I need to learn more about what people are doing within there.
Hmm.
their smart home infrastructure. I'm not sure this is the question to ask. It's interesting seeing some of the protocols people are using.
Sure.
I feel like I've deployed most of these, and it can be a little crazy and hectic to stay on top of. Like, is this device Zigbee or is it Z-Wave? I don't know that any of the responses are particularly surprising, however.
No, I don't think so either. I just recently got my first Zigbee devices, and I'm definitely I definitely see why people like Zigbee.
Yeah, they're great. They're great. I'm a big fan. I have a ton of Zigbee devices in my house.
I one of my one of my Discord mods, Nighthawk, sent me a USB stick to plug into my server for Home Assistant, and it just sat there for the longest time. And then I finally got some smart plugs and that sort of thing, and it's like, oh, they all work together to help, rather than
Hmm.
taking up network traffic and distracting from everything else.
Right, right, and congesting your Wi-Fi bandwidth.
Mm-hmm.
I see James Collins joking a little bit about no love for Matter. Things like Matter and Threat. It reminds me of that XKCD comic, if you've ever seen that, where they're like, "Hey, there are 5 different standards. I'm going to create one to unify all of them." And then it's like, okay, now you've just ended up with 6 different standards now. And then, next time someone's going to come up with another one to unify the 6, and it'll just be 7.
Mm-hmm.
It feels like that's happening in the smart home protocol thing area right now.
Yeah, yeah. But here's the thing. I appreciate that there are different standards, because if one of them manages to be compromised or whatever, you've still got other things that you can use if necessary.
Yep, I agree. I agree. The next 2 questions, I don't
Hmm.
think we had to spend an unusual amount of time on
Sure,
them because we didn't get many responses for people who are self-hosting activity pub platforms.
sure.
Admittedly, I use the Fediverse a lot. I'm on
Hmm.
Mastodon. That's where I spend most of my time on socials.
Sure.
I don't deploy my own activity pub platform. It's a little daunting, the amount of bandwidth it can take. I think
Yeah.
I've tried deploying Mastodon on one of my servers that
Hmm.
I had a ton on, and it actually wouldn't deploy because it needed more resources than I had available. It's the
Wow.
first time I've ever run into that.
Wow.
And I think just the impact really well performing posts can have on your survey when you get a ton of like boosts and favorites and stuff.
Sure.
That's one thing I don't mind going to other hosted servers, but they do go hand in hand. So and there's some other platforms not like Mastodon that I think people do are a little less hesitant to self-host, like PeerTube. A lot of people use that as kind of like a YouTube replacement,
Hmm.
even if they haven't federated it with other services. People are using these things on the back end.
Sure. Interesting. Yeah, I don't think I'd want to host a video platform. That just sounds awful.
Yeah, I wouldn't either. Also, someone in the chat, Kazi, is saying DB Tech, your cadence of speaking is similar to Tim Cook.
That's interesting. I don't know if I've ever actually paid attention to the way he talks, but I'll have to take a look at that.
Yeah.
Part of the issue that I'm facing today, and it's because I'm not prepared, is I'm hearing myself in my headphones, and I can't figure out how to turn off the monitoring in the app. So I keep confusing myself as I'm
Ugh,
talking.
yeah.
But I will definitely have to check out some Tim Cook speeches or presentations or something and see.
Yeah, Tim Apple.
Yeah, Tim Apple.
The next couple of questions are kind of similar. Are you self-hosting any game servers? More people aren't than
Right.
are. And to no surprise, Minecraft
Minecraft.
takes the lead on that. I'm
Hmm.
not sure if I'll ask this again next year. It
Sure.
was very interesting to me. I do game, but I'm not a huge gamer. And I
Hmm.
learned, or as I was putting these together and just making sure I had things spelled correctly because this was a free text response,
Right.
I learned about a lot of new games that are popular.
Huh.
And so it's interesting. I'm sure someone out there will find this insightful as they look for new game servers to host. I see Terraria talked about a lot. I'm a little surprised that's as low on the list as it is, given how much I see people talking about self-hosting that. But
Sure.
I'm not an expert, so I'm not sure if that's actually surprising to other people.
Yeah, I've hosted Minecraft, Valheim, and I think an Arc server once. I actually wouldn't mind. I wouldn't mind self-hosting a Pal World server, but I'm gonna wait to see how that lawsuit plays out first.
Yeah, yeah. Let them duke that out with Nintendo for a little bit.
All right, let's see. Favorite self-hosted application. Oops, wait. Hold on, I skipped something there. Oh, there we go. How do you
Yeah. So
self-host databases?
yeah, so I probably should have asked this question earlier. It feels a little odd thrown sprinkled in here. I got a lot of
Sure.
flack for this question because I asked before about different ways of containerization, so Docker or Podman or something like that. And then in this question, I just completely ignored them and bucketed the containers as Docker. So lesson learned, I have that in my notes for next year. I won't
All
make this
all
mistake
right.
again. But I think the answers this year are similar to last year.
Mm-hmm.
Most people are just spinning up databases per application or software that they're deploying so they can easily spin them up and take them down and not worry about other services going down as well.
Well, you talked in your live stream last night about having a single Postgres database for everything. I think you're a lunatic, but then you explained how you do an export of each individual thing on a regular. So that made it less concerning about your sociopathy, but
Yeah, I know it's unusual, but I'm so particular about how I do things that I'm
Mhm.
confident that I can manage it. If I was one of those people who updated things once a month and didn't regularly monitor my infrastructure, I don't think I could get away with it like I do.
Sure.
But I know I'm crazy.
As long as you're aware, that's the first step. All
Um,
right, this one.
but now we can jump into the what is your favorite self-hosted application question, which might arguably be the most interesting question. There were a lot of responses to this, as you can imagine.
Yeah.
320 total applications mentioned.
Wow.
Um, any with fewer than 15 did not make the chart because I did not want this to be too unwieldy on the web page.
Sure.
But there's a lot. There's a lot going on. Jellyfin overtook
Hmm.
Home Assistant, which again, within the communities I visit, that seems to be true. That seems
Hmm.
to be the case. But Plex is right up there as well.
Yep.
Image is fairly high this year. I'm not surprised to see that.
I think that's isn't that a fairly big jump from last year?
I think so. I remember seeing it at some point, but I don't remember it having been that high. I should pull it up in the background and check.
Sure.
But I see people talking about that all the time. I actually for Vault Warden, I had some I had Bitwarden and Vault Warden responses, and I wasn't sure if people who were deploying Vault Warden were saying Bitwarden
Right.
or not. And so I lumped them all together, but I didn't say Bitwarden Vault Warden on the chart because it didn't look great. The label was too long. So I
Right.
probably should note that at some point that's actually a combination of people who are hosting the actual Bitwarden implementation
Sure. Sure.
versus Vault Warden. But I'm not surprised. That's another popular one. It's on top of Nextcloud.
Hmm.
Um, I think the R stack is up there. It's I think I had maybe 4 responses that actually listed a specific R application.
Huh.
It is legitimately people who are saying the entire stack or the entire suite of apps are their favorites. Um,
Wow.
I'm not surprised given why people are
Hmm.
or why such a large population are self-hosting.
Sure. All right. Getty
Oh,
Piehole. I
yeah.
I'm surprised to see. Oh, okay. We're talking about favorite apps, not which are you hosting. The Piehole is so much higher than AdGuard Home.
Hmm.
I've run both. I prefer AdGuard Home out of the two.
I agree. There's also a third now that's been popping up. It's like Technidium or something like that.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. I'm seeing more people talk about it. I remember it came up, but it wasn't a substantial number of responses
Okay.
for that.
Let's see.
But yeah, this is an
Yeah.
interesting list
Oh.
if you're looking for things to self-hosted applications to deploy.
Hmm.
This is, I think, a decent gauge as to what I see the community talk about when people talk about their top 5 applications.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm always interested to see what other people what their favorite stuff is. I don't even remember what my answer was now.
I think I said actual budget. I'm a finance guy, so of course
Sure.
my budgeting app is my favorite.
Sure, sure. Let's see. 320 individual pieces of software submitted. Wow. And I've probably made videos on most of them.
Probably there were a few that I had never heard of,
Huh.
and I had to Google to make sure they were actual pieces of
Okay.
software. There were also a fair amount that were of people just saying I don't have a favorite or I can't think of one, which
Okay.
I did not include in the chart.
Gotcha. All right. Well, I think our last section here is going to be demographics.
Yep. So all of these questions were completely optional. I did not want to pressure anyone to give information. Again, this is helpful for me just on the back end to understand who users are. But I think that it is also interesting to other people to see what type of people are self-hosting. I feel like in the first one, the age range, I feel like there was a response in an older age range last year than there is this year. I hope that person is okay.
Right.
And
I'm
just
glad
maybe
you said
didn't
it.
get to take the survey this year. I might be misremembering it. But it seems like it's geared towards 20, 30, maybe 40-year-olds. It'll be interesting to see over time how that shifts and how that changes.
Sure.
I think they're more in the 10 to 19-year-old bucket this year than last year. So that's encouraging to see.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. People getting started early. I think
Absolutely.
That's great.
What is your gender? I don't think this is super surprising.
No.
That man gets the top response with 3,300 responses. We have woman and non-binary. I've learned from my time on Mastodon and the Fediverse, self-hosting community is actually, I think, really accepting towards kind of the LGBT crowd and everyone who comes along with that, and that's been really encouraging. And so I thought really hard about how to incorporate this into my survey in a way that was respectful, but also something that I could easily consolidate and aggregate. So
Sure. Oh, I think that's great. All right.
I also love the "I'm not a man, I'm
Nice.
a moist hoagie."
That needs to be an option next year. You don't want to be.
I will add moist hoagie just for that comment.
And then, wow.
Next up, what country do you currently reside in? I'm also trying to figure out a better way to visualize this. I didn't want to show a chart because there are a lot of countries and I didn't want to omit any. I'll probably just have to format a better table than this.
Sure.
I don't think this differs too much from last year. The US, obviously, at the top. Germany is always second in my traffic stats, so that's not surprising. Followed up by UK, Canada, and France. But it's cool seeing all of the other countries and locations that are listed here, even if it's just one or two responses from them. It's cool either seeing how far the reach is for some of these things or just seeing what answer someone was making up because they thought they'd be funny. But I'll choose to believe it was the former.
No, that's and I've always appreciated seeing things like this, like in my own analytics and that sort of thing, because like I'm just sitting in this little temporary room in my garage talking to a camera most of the time. And to be able to know that I'm talking to people in countries I may not have even ever heard of is kind of a humbling thing for me.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. Someone is happy that Ireland is on the list. I'm trying to find Ireland.
Oops.
Oh, there we go. 25 responses from Ireland.
Oh yeah, there it is. All right.
Ukraine as well. Ukraine has 12.
12, yeah, that's
responses.
Good. All right. If you're employed, do you work in a technical field? This one doesn't surprise me.
No, and I think it's very similar to last year as well. That kind of makes sense. I don't even know if it's worth including in future surveys because it's clear what the answer is going to be.
Sure.
But anyway, it's interesting nonetheless. Next question, what's your primary mobile device's operating system? By the way, no matter how I word questions, there are a lot of people who just don't read them. I remember with what's your favorite self-hosted application? So many people listed like 5. I'm like, what do I do with this? And so same thing with this. People are like, oh, one of my devices is this, one of my devices is this. And I was like very clearly trying to get it a way that was easy to decipher. So if someone listed two, I always took the first answer as the response.
Oh, there you
So
go.
if anyone's listening and did that, keep that in mind. I think this was somewhat similar splits last year, except Graphene OS popped up in the other responses this year. I don't think I saw that last year.
Isn't
I
that
know
just
that's a
de-Googled Android?
yeah. I
Okay.
think it's one of those like super privacy focused forks of Android.
Gotcha.
So not super surprised to see that pop up.
No.
There were a few others mentioned, but they had, I don't know, maybe only one or two responses. So I did not include them.
Sure. Okay.
The next question is always to guilt trip my readers. Have you donated to a self-hosted project in the last year? Skewed towards no. It's encouraging to see there are a fair amount of people who have donated, so I'm happy to see that. I would encourage more people to donate, even if it's not a lot.
Right.
A lot of developers are spending a lot of time and effort into the software that we're deploying and that we get for free. So I don't mind skipping that, Starbucks coffee once or twice a week to
Right.
give a developer a couple bucks when I can.
Absolutely. And then our last question.
Yep. What's the highest level of education you've completed? I think some of these shuffled around versus last year. It'd be a really interesting case study to see if there was something behind that or if it's just a broader reach meant I got a better sample of the population.
Sure.
I think bachelor's degree was at the top last year, but I think master's degree made its way up or is a bit higher than it was last year.
Gotcha.
But I think this is probably about how I would have guessed the order would have come across.
Sure.
I would think so. Not super surprising, a little insightful. Again, this is one that maybe if my surveys are too lengthy in the future, I would consider cutting.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely some that I think we expect certain answers on, and the data has shown us for the last 2 years that it's basically what you would expect for something like that.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and maybe like I split up and run a survey that's just like, hey, here's a self-hosted demographic survey just to learn more about people, and then I'll do like one that focuses on hardware and software at another point in time in the year. That might be worth doing. Yeah, because I think a lot of people are fatigued at this point in the survey when this is their 37th question.
Sure.
And they're optional. They probably opted into skipping some of these.
Yeah. Well, we got through it, and it took us only an hour and a half. Not too bad.
Yeah, not bad at all.
Let's see. Make sure we haven't. I'm sure I've missed a ton of stuff over here in the comments. So many, or not many of us old folks. Yeah.
I love that comment.
Yeah. Apoxa says they like the split approach. I agree. I think that might be an idea. Let's see. Yeah, I think we actually covered all of that as we went. Yeah, no, this is great. Again, thank you for letting me host this for you this year. I think this was the highest number of concurrent viewers I've ever had on a video before or on a live stream.
Oh wow! Oh, that's great.
Yeah, so I think that's awesome. I'm really, really stoked about that. If you guys aren't aware, Ethan recently started his own YouTube channel. Did his first live stream last night, and you went over kind of a live deployment of DocMost and went through went through the setup process and kind of poked around it a little bit.
After some audio issues at the beginning.
You know what? I've been doing live streams off and on for a couple of years, and you saw how today went. It's stuff happens. But no, I think after you got past the audio issues in the first couple of minutes, I watched it this morning while I was drinking my coffee, and even commented like, I wish I could slow down and be more thoughtful when I'm talking about things like you did in your video. You did such a great job.
No, I appreciate it. Thank you.
So if you guys haven't subscribed, go check out Self-Hosts over on YouTube. And I think I've got links to everything in the video description. And if I don't, I'll pin a comment.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, and David, thanks a ton for having me on here.
Yeah.
I love the idea of making this an annual thing. You and I connecting in some format. Maybe
Yeah.
it changes every year to review the results. And I also want to thank everyone in the chat and everyone who took the survey.
Hmm.
Would not have been possible without other people. I know surveys aren't always fun to take. I tried to make it easy. I think some people ran into some issues with the software, passing that along to the developers. But again, it's self-hosted. I'm super grateful that it existed and that I could easily self-host it to facilitate. But really, it wouldn't be possible without other people. So
Sure.
super appreciative of all the participation from other folks.
Yeah, absolutely. No, this has been great. I really appreciate everybody who participated in the survey, everybody who has at least popped in for a couple of minutes to hang out with us and listen to us kind of babble on about this. And I really dig going through all of this and just seeing what people are doing. I really enjoy these surveys each year.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually think it would be interesting to grab just a random viewer each year and maybe bring them onto
Oh
the
yeah,
live stream with us to talk through things,
yeah. That's
to get other perspectives.
right. Yeah. Let's talk about that offline. But I think that's a great idea.
Maybe a moist hoagie
Right.
appearance. I'm just kidding. But thanks again. This has been great. I do appreciate it.
Yeah, yeah. So this will actually be a VOD probably tomorrow. And I'll try to make sure that it's got all the links and everything in there if they're not already there. But I think we've been at this for an hour and 35 minutes approximately. And I think we're going to go ahead and wrap this up. Again, thanks to everybody for hanging out today. And we'll definitely talk to you in the next video.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.